this session, we have two gentlemen with us from the Government Accountability Office. J. Howard Arp is the director of the GAO's Forensic Audits team. He investigates fraud, waste, and abuse, so all of the things that we are most interested in. He also oversees the FraudNet hotline, and he has more than 14 years of experience in the Inspector General community as well. Taka Ariga is the GAO's first chief data scientist and director of their innovation lab, where he works a lot with AI and advanced analytics. And just as a side note, he also happens to be a cellist who performs around DC. So we are going to get started here first with Taka. Go ahead, take it away.
Sure, let me share my screen. And I really appreciate the National Press Foundation for the invitation. I was sort of doing some thinking last night. I think the mission of GAO does align pretty closely with the ethos of being a good investigative journalist. So, much like the noise that we live through these days, there are certainly tons of partisanship, disinformation, disparity, and distrust. So from a GAO perspective, we don't aim to break a news story, but we really do take the care to make sure that we cut through the noise. Part of that is, if you look at this concentric circle, GAO is all about accountability, integrity, and reliability. Those are sort of our guiding North Star, our unwavering sort of principle that we adhere to. But these taglines don't just auto-magically sort of happen, right? We sort of have to really apply a rigorous methodology. And GAO usually is known for being objective, nonpartisan, in terms of our approach to a number of really thorny challenges facing the federal government. So, excuse me, if you take a look at the concentric circle, at the very outline of this, and again, I think this is very sort of similar to some of the ethos of investigative journalists, we adhere to evidence-based policymaking. On behalf of Congress, we try to unpack complicated issues such as improper payments, such as global warming, and such as some of the physical infrastructure related issues that really we want to take an objective sort of view towards those issues and be able to sort of unpack them in a narratively linear way. Part of the sort of approach that we do that is really through a rigorous process we call the quality assurance framework. Nothing gets out of the GAO door unless every single sentence has been essentially fact-checked, referenced, and indexed. We exercise a lot of professional skepticism when it comes to who we talk to, when it comes to the literature that we research, when it comes to the experts that sort of join our panel. To make sure not only are we covering the sort of a technical performance of any programs that we're looking at, but also, so there's that effectiveness and efficiency part of that program, but making sure that we're covering the economics of those programs, that we're covering the equity of those programs, but also, this is perhaps more relevant on the AI side, is the ethics of those programs. So taken together under the GAO's quality assurance framework, we take these sort of 5 E's: efficiency, effectiveness, economics, ethics, and equity as sort of our guiding ethos and how we approach our work. And so part of that, if you continue to peel the layer forward, is now we have to have a very robust analytical capability to address this sort of unique GAO pan-governmental mission. Right? We don't just deal with DoD data. We don't just deal with justice data. We have to sort of dig deep across all corners of the federal government. And sometimes, and the CARES Act is a good example of that, many of the dollar actually flows through federal, but down to the state and local level. And so our partnership at that, at sort of a locality, but also at the international level in terms of advocating for continued oversight on topics like AI is even, it's more important than ever. So how do we have an adaptive capability to address all types of information coming to GAO, to be able to really apply a kind of analytical methodology that can withstand the scrutiny, right? Because we know we do live in a hyperpartisan world. So everything that we do has to be justified and transparent. and really be methodologically rigorous. So that's one of the reasons why GAO reports often are hundreds of pages with very detailed appendices in terms of how we approach the methodology, assumptions that we make, and a very detailed and faithful reflection of the data that we analyze, and how we sort of came about with some of the audit recommendations that we end up issuing. So perhaps a lesser known part of GAO is that, we certainly have started out looking at financial audit accounting type of work. But these days, by and large, many of our sort of mission team focus on programmatic issues. So again, whether these are AI or global warming, et cetera. But we also have a very robust capability on the idea of foresight. So it's not just about oversight and insight, but how do we then have these horizon scanning capability to be able to anticipate future black swan event. Now, I'm not saying we couldn't just, look into the magic 8 ball and say, yep, COVID was going to happen 2.5 years ago. But going back to AI as an example, I think that it is a good representation on back in 2017. We already recognized the impacts of artificial intelligence on various forms of programs. And so part of that is how do we then build the capacity to look into implications of AI? So between 2017 and now, we have done a number of technology assessment reports looking at applications of AI in drug discovery, in healthcare, in forensic, sort of law enforcement domain, et cetera. But we also wanted to be a sort of a hands-on practitioners of AI because talking about the implication in abstract, that's useful, but it will be better if we can have a very nuanced discussions around when we say AI is challenging, well, what do we mean technically? So this is where the Innovation Lab comes in. This is where a lot of our foresight function come in to say, if we were to audit AI, I draw the analogy as akin to buying a car, right? If you're going to buy a car, you wouldn't just read the user manual. You wouldn't just go talk to the salesperson. You would test drive the car. So how do we actually test drive AI? How do we test drive blockchain? How do we test drive a number of these emerging capabilities so that we are, as practitioners of these technology, can speak more authoritatively on how they work? So then that sort of brings back to the original ethos of GAO. That's how we manifest accountability, integrity, and reliabilities. So even in the world that we live in that are hyper-partisan, a lot of disinformation, GAO tends to maintain that level of objectivity, that level of credibility, so that the work that we issue are usually very well respected. And GAO's recommendations are, they may not get adopted as soon as that we'd like, but they generally get done. I mean, we've done studies that over, the sort of 4 or 5 year period, most of GAO's recommendations are adopted. And I think Congress are starting to recognize the ROI of GAO, and we love to talk about this. In the past 5 years, for every dollar appropriated to GAO, the ROI we give back, vis-a-vis a measure through our financial impact, is hundreds of dollars per dollar appropriated to GAO. No, with this respect to other agencies in the federal government, I think you'll be hard pressed to find that level of ROI in sort of a public sector entity. So this is sort of my observations on how the work of GAO, I think, ties pretty well with the approach on sort of a investigative tradecraft. So we're here to talk a little bit about how we approach data analysis, and forgive the visual here. And I know they're a little cheeky, but hopefully it will make sense. Broadly speaking, right, data analysis is something that is important in driving towards stories telling, because you want to make sure that you understand the nuance, you understand the trend and patterns, you can speak more authoritatively. But to me, it's akin to like a recipe book. You could have a bushel of apples, you could have milk, egg, and sugar, you could have spices, but ultimately whether you end up baking an apple pie, apple galette, apple crisp, that is subject to that nuanced function. So generally speaking, the way that I usually talk about approaching data analysis is, first and foremost, you have to have some sort of hypothesis, some sort of hunch, like what are you trying to uncover? And then you go through this virtuous cycle of how do you collect the data? How do you wrangle that data? Because garbage in, garbage out. How do you actually analyze the data? But more importantly, how do you then tell a story on that analysis? To me, the goal is not to uncover answers. To me, the goal should always be how do we generate better questions? So this is that virtuous cycle process to say, usually in my experience, the first set of questions are informative directionally, but ultimately what usually end up in our report are those secondary, tertiary, and subsequent downstream questions that we are able to peel back the onion that really gets to the crux of the issue. So, starting with a hunch in sort of a data sciencey jargon way, we say, what is your hypothesis? What are you trying to prove here? And then we start thinking about what kind of data might be available to sort of help test that hypothesis. Now, here's one of the sort of manifestation on how GAO really adheres to a quality assurance framework. We don't just take data at their face value. We go through an nth degree of sort of evaluation to make sure that we can answer three distinct questions. Is data complete? Is data accurate? And is data reliable? Very commonsensical questions, right? But very technically difficult to answer. So how do you know whether data is complete? So there are tons of techniques that we employ to really make sure that whatever GAO gets our hands on are in fact able to meet those sort of criteria around completeness, accuracies, and reliability. And then we get into this sort of notion of how do we then, match data together in a way that sort of makes sense. So this is where the data wrangling piece comes in. Oftentimes, I'm sure it's no news to all the audience here, data rarely ever comes in sort of a pristine format that gets put on silver platter to say, please analyze this information. We've been waiting for somebody to come in. They're missing values. There are sort of aspects of the data that perhaps are in different units, right? So there are well-documented examples where one should not be combining a metrics-based data sets with like an English inches-based sort of type of data. Those are the kind of things that the sort of data cleansing process will sort of hammer out. So the questions here is the data actually analyzable? And then the second part is I do advocate this a lot. Is data augmentable, right? It's one thing to analyze one source of information, but can that data be augmented with publicly available information? Might that data be augmented with something else to help corroborate certain parts of that information? So how do you combine them together so that you have a larger corpus of information to base your analysis on? So this is where we get into the analysis of that data. To me, this is the easiest part, right? Once you get the data collection piece down, once you get the data wrangling part of the piece down, analysis is a breeze. I'm being facetious, of course, but relatively speaking, there are all sorts of analytical techniques, but unless we have that upfront data quality issue solved, none of the analysis matter because garbage in and garbage out. So some of the questions that we do ask in this phase is the analytical techniques appropriate? And I'll give an example. In the sort of AI world, a lot of sort of ambitious data scientists always talk about, would love to do more, deep learning, neural network, those sort of fancy terms. But those techniques fundamentally are not transparent and not linear. And you cannot explain on how those conclusions are being arrived. So can you imagine GAO applying neural network models to a bunch of financial data to say, yep, grandma committed a fraud? And judge will ask us, well, how do you know grandma committed a fraud? No idea. The model told us to do so. That is not a position that we want to be in when it comes to our analysis. We want to make sure that the approach that we take is defensible, is traceable, can be replicated and verifiably evaluated. So that's what I mean when we say that is the analytical techniques appropriate. And so there are also mathematical considerations around sampling and all that good stuff. And the other part is professional skepticism, right? Are there alternative approach to looking at this information, and what might that look like? And for me, I always try to focus both the micro picture that the data is telling, but also the macro trend. So an example of macro trends will be, are there sort of across time horizon, across geographics, are there specific pockets that sort of jump out versus, micro sort of cadence, maybe, within a short period of time or within, the same cluster of zip code, might some of that trend inform, because we live in a diverse country, right? So try not to treat analysis of data as a monolithic. I think that it's also a helpful construct. Now, the last piece here is how once you've done all these analyses, what is the story that you're trying to tell? And this is the piece that I did sort of had to think about how we talk about these things. Because originally I was tempted to say, well, how do you tell the truth? And this may be slightly controversial. I actually don't think data analysis is about focusing on truth, right? Because you can sort of massage data one way or the other to a sort of preformed notion. But it really is about how do you tell that story so that you can let your audience interpret what that definition of truth is for those individuals. So if you laid out, quality data, if you laid out quality analysis that are verified and traceable, I think the stories themselves is really the art craft of journalism comes in to say, how do you then connect the various dots that are important for the readers? And so this is why it's an apple pie, right? And for GAO, we may be baking apple pie, but for some other organization, taking the same set of ingredients, they may be baking an apple crisps and some other sort of variations of dessert that uses similar ingredients. And then usually we go through a couple of rounds of this. So to make sure that we can better focus on the questions that we're trying to find some trends and patterns against. And so I try not to lay this out in a sort of a linear way from left to right, from top to down, but it really is a set of cycles. And ultimately, it might actually change your original hypothesis, maybe changing your hunch, maybe you change your supposition. And I think all that contribute to sort of good reporting, right? So if you can sort of peel back layers of onion. Couple of pro tips, right? I usually try to think about how can I leave behind sort of a actionable, tactical advice, to the audience that I'm speaking to. And some of this you may already be familiar, but certainly happy to answer any question that folks may have. First and foremost, we are in a renaissance era of open source tool. And open source is a fancy way of saying free tools, right? If you have a laptop, there are plenty of open source tools out there that really enable robust analysis. And so whether those are R, Python, I think those are well-documented examples of that. Tons of tutorials online that are free that can sort of get you going in terms of how do you ingest information, how do you do some of the sort of basic data cleansing, how do you sort of mashing data together, how do you start applying different packages to support different types of analysis. So that's number one and two. Number three, and this is the part that perhaps doesn't get talked about a lot. Always look for metadata. This is the data about the data, right? So let's say if you were collecting some, I don't know, cell phone call log or something like that, you will have a set of columns that says, to number, from number, duration of that call, et cetera. The metadata sometimes is equally as informative. When was that call log extracted? Who extracted that information? What was the source of that information? That may not be readily present in the rows and columns of data that you're looking at, but it does sort of uncover and give additional context to the information that is relevant. So I always say, whenever possible, ask and request and collect metadata. And then the fourth piece here, I think, is similar to the data wrangling piece. Treat data as informants, right? We wouldn't necessarily just rely on one informant, but to the extent possible, go to the original source, not some spreadsheet that somebody along the way filtered, selected, and make some presumption on what that request should look like. And that in particular sometimes falls in with how the information is being requested to begin with. And I know there are sort of prior sanctions around FOIA. So, it's thinking about the source of record, not just some report that has been sort of processed and to show a very specific set of information. More sources are often better than one, and that's the same for GAO as well. We may be collecting some data, but we always try to triangulate what are some of the additional data that we can augment that information with. So whether it's open source information, single audits is a good example, right? There's a repository all audit that gets submitted. There are census data, there are NOAA data, there are tons of sort of contract data flowing out there that can help us triangulate and augment certain facets of that information that we want to highlight. So I always say mash as many different data that you can. Sometimes you end up getting very surprising results. Six, when we talk about data analysis, I think that the most traditional way of approaching it is rows and columns, like Excel spreadsheet, database, for example. But there are sort of interesting analysis that you can glean from use of graph database, and that is a fancy word of saying mapping out the relationship. It's a social network analysis, very similar to Facebook. Who do you know on this ecosystem? And then you can sort of identify pockets of not only the entity, but also the relationship of an interest, and maybe there are intermediaries of interest. And so I think within GAO, we have a number of very interesting use case for something like graph database. Geospatial analysis, right? When Katrina happened, there were a lot of sort of in my prior life dealing with insurance claims. So sometimes company would say, oh yeah, I lost all my sort of business, so I need insurance claim. But it's interesting if you start layering geographical information on where the flood actually happened and maybe correlate that with some of the Instagram photos from those flood, you can be much more nuanced with geospatial information to say, nope, in fact, your store was not flooded based on some of these triangulation of information. So additional layers of depth. And I talk about telling the story. Visual, it's always better than rows and columns, right? Who wants to sort of, as a reader, dissect rows and columns? Because human brains are very difficult to process that kind of representation. But we're much more of a visual creature, and so this is where I think a lot of news organizations have started to use something that GAO is piloting as well. Is this concept of scrolly. And I'm going to get the term wrong here, scrolly telly. I think Washington Post has done this in sort of an underwater mining. Essentially, it's a page that continuously scroll, and every now and then it inserts the data points at the right position of that scroll to augment the context. So it's not just like, bam, here's a dashboard, have a nice day. And so that's something that I think it's a continued evolution of visualization. Most recently, just as a matter of fact, Monday, GAO made available a set of anti-fraud resources through our website. And there's a lot of that type of visualization as well to sort of really illustrate the complexity of federal fraud, right? All of the characters, all of the schemes, all of the programs that have to intersect together with sort of policy constraints here and there. It's a complicated story, and how do we use visualization to really tell that story? And by the way, when I say visualization, I don't mean bar charts, I don't mean line chart. I mean, those are visual, yes, but they don't necessarily tell stories as effective as, let's say, a Sankey chart or a heat map or even that scrolly telly type of construct. I already mentioned this. Analysis of the data is typically the easiest part. It's a sort of a Pareto's construct here, 80-20, right? We spend 80% of our time cleaning the data to make sure that the data are analyzable, and then really only the 20% of the time to really dig into the analysis of that data. The more you do, that 80-20 becomes easier, becomes more repeatable. But maybe if this is your first foray into the rigors of data analysis, just keep in mind focus most of the attention on data quality and that data wrangling part of the conversation. Something that GAO does to the nth degree, comment your assumption, comment your parameters, document expected results, because we do expect our work to be subject to professional scrutiny, whether that's through internal peer review, whether that's through sort of external peer review, whether that is through some sort of courtroom scenario that we have to argue with the lawyers. We expect that kind of professional scrutiny, so that the layers of documentation requirements for us is very rigorous. The idea here is that any lay person should be able to walk in and reasonably reconstruct our conclusions, right? So that knowledge just doesn't live in somebody's head. Last but not the least, and I think this audience in particular, exercise professional skepticism. Just because you're handed a set of data doesn't mean that's always the right set of data. Maybe that's not the complete set of data. Even if the analysis show and conforms with the original hypothesis that you laid out there, maybe ask more questions to say, well, that's kind of too good to be true. If it's too good to be true, it is probably too good to be true. So how do we then exercise that professional skepticism to continually generate better questions? And I think all of that sort of collectively, together really helps to build a quality, reliable, and credible story in terms of sort of journalism, and then that's very much similar to how GAO approaches our oversight product, right? So I know that was a lot of information. I know I talk fairly fast, but I just want to maybe open up to see if the audience have any questions. And by the way, no questions off the table. So I know we're on the record. Happy to answer any questions the audience may have. Paul.
Hi, my name is Paul Egan. I write for the Detroit Free Press, and I'm just interested to know what percentage of the GAO's work is non-discretionary, maybe required by statute or some schedule that you have, and what percentage is discretionary stuff you guys can come up with on your own, and whether there are kind of restrictions or parameters within which you can choose a topic for investigation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a great question. And I'll start, and maybe Howard, if you know the specific number, because I don't, but our Comptroller General was very specific. Like, he wants GAO to work on matters of most pressing needs. So whether that's climate change, whether that's federal debt, whether that's improper payments, et cetera. But you're absolutely right. GAO has a large portfolios of what we call mandate. Statutory, it says Comptroller General shall every 12 months, every 24 months do X, Y, Z. I think that is, relatively speaking, a smaller part of our work. And perhaps a larger part of the piece of that pie, going back to the food analogy here, is requests coming out of both Senate and congressional members, whether it's through committee, whether through individual members. They may say, hey, I have a concern about these issues. What could GAO do? And so usually that's how the conversation starts. But consistent with our ethos of maintaining that objectivity and nonpartisanship, we do go through that scoping process to make sure that we're not necessarily tackling a gotcha questions with some sort of output in mind, right? So we will, I'll give an example. A question posed may be something along the line of, how does immigration take jobs away from immigrants? I mean, from United States citizens. We probably will rescope that to say, what are the economic impacts of immigration policy or something along those lines, which then not only does they neutralize the language, but is much more specific hypotheses that we can then collect data against. Now, the third tranche of the work that we do, it's called the Comptroller General Authority. So again, consistent with Gene Dodaro's focus on what matters to the country, he has the flexibility to initiate work as necessary. So most of our foresight function that horizon scanning, even our AI accountability framework was generated under the Comptroller General Authority. We are collaborating with a number of other agencies to really try to tackle improper payments. So some of the improper payments work is stemming from mandates, some of it are from congressional requests, but certainly some of these are forward-looking aspects of it are sort of generated through that flexibilities that Comptroller General have. So we're about to publish our strategic plan from 2022 to 2027, and that will talk, I think, help inform what GAO views as important, and the specific mix of mandate, congressional requests, and Comptroller General's own authority that will ebbs and flow year over year. But those are the three primary tranches. But Howard, I don't know if you know the delineation.
I don't have any exact number for you, Paul, but what I would say is that I would argue the vast majority of our work comes from either mandates or congressional requests. The CG authority is, it's there. We're able to use it. Taka mentioned the anti-fraud resource that we just published last Monday. That was performed under the Comptroller General's authority, but by far and large, it's as our role as the investigative arm of the Congress, and in order to maintain our independence, that's sort of what he was addressing there, in that we determine the scope, we determine the methodology. The requests come in, and then a lot of times based on our internal knowledge, different things, we design the actual audit or investigation such that is appropriate and to show our independence from the congressional body.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gabriel?
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Gabriel, I'm from CNBC. I have two questions. My first one is really easy. A lot of other agencies, like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, will telegraph to us like when certain releases are coming out. Do you guys do something similar, given that you're not doing reports that are on as much of a schedule as another agency might be? And then my second question is, do you have a particular report that you've worked on recently that you're really proud of, either because it stretched your skills or because it encapsulated all of those elements that you described in making the apple pie?
Yeah, the short answer is GAO generally doesn't telegraph the details of what's coming up. Part of that is we want to make sure that we maintain that integrity. A lot of issues that we end up tackling are sort of thorny, right? So if agency themselves disagree with some of our recommendation, we don't want to go like, hey, CNBC, we're about to ding XYZ, and then cat's out of the bag, and then some of that conversation gets really turned a different way. But there are mandates that calls for GAO to no later than after whatever day to do whatever. I mean, that could be an indication of when we must publish certain thing. Certainly from a CARES Act perspective, we've been on the sort of tremendous pressure of doing almost near real-time audits of all of the CARES Act funding. And so that's on top of all of our day job, right? So we have additional 100 plus or so CARES Act related mandates. So I think that's a tribute to the GAO employees' professionalism in sort of getting that out. And then we sometimes give sort of courtesy notice to our congressional stakeholders to say, look, we're about 20%, we're about 80%, we're about 90% done. There's some comment period, there's some stakeholder comment periods. Can we give you some preliminary briefing? It kind of depends on facts and circumstances of those jobs. But generally speaking, we don't tweet out to say, hey, next Tuesday, we're about to issue XYZ, which, pros and cons to that, depending on the topic. But I think that's generally what GAO falls under. But I'll turn over to Howard as well. I, as a sort of director of innovation lab, doesn't get into the day-to-day publication of the report. Part of it is that I need to experiment on how different technology works. And so as a de-risking function, I am not directly embedded into our audit and engagements. But that being said, I was a signatory on the AI accountability framework, which quite proud of. I think this is there's 170 or so different AI ethical frameworks out there, right? So talk about fragmentation. We actually push those sort of high-level aspiration down to a set of practices, questions, and procedures that program offices and independent third-party auditors can follow, which means they're implementable. You know, AI should do no harm. I don't know what that means. I don't know what to do with that. So this is something that we do sort of are quite proud of, that particular framework. And then more and more, I think the GAO's aspiration is to go beyond just being known as an audit agency. We want to be known as a knowledge transfer agency, especially in the digital world. And that means we have to have the right capacity, the right capability, the right resources. So more and more of GAO's product, you'll see a lot of computational oriented type of verification attached to it. Howard, anything you want to add?
No, you know, like Taka said, there really isn't any advance notice on these matters. One thing I would maybe point to is there are some fairly regular recurring legislation that occurs every year that you can look to sort of get an idea of what GAO is being mandated to start looking at. One, you know, the initial big one that comes to mind every year is the NDAA. So when Congress passes that, there's usually a ton of work included in there for GAO to pursue. So there are some ways to at least have some insights into what we might be looking into as these different pieces of legislation are passed.
Yeah, any other questions before we transition to Howard? All right, Howard, it's all yours.
All right, excellent. Well, good morning if you're on the East Coast, or anywhere but the East Coast, excuse me. Good afternoon if you're here with me on the East Coast. And so I do recognize we may be what's between you and your lunch break. So I don't want to, as an investigator, I can fully appreciate liking to eat. But a little bit of background about me, just real briefly, because I think it does give some context into my experiences with data and accountability. So I started in the federal government over 20 years ago, federal law enforcement as a forensic chemist with the Drug Enforcement Administration. Then after a short stint there, I went over to the then U.S. Customs Service, what is now the HSI, and worked international drug investigations on the border as a special agent. And from there, I went to the Small Business Administration, IG, as a criminal investigator, worked all the way up to headquarters before coming to GAO in our IG's office as the Assistant Inspector General for Investigations. And then back in 2019, moved over to my current position as the Director of Investigations here in our Forensic Audit and Investigative Service team. So throughout my career, I've had tons of access to different kinds of data, and recognizing that there's different ways to access data. Taka mentioned open source data. In this day and age, I think back to when I started, and you know, email was sort of a fairly new thing for us, versus just writing memos and things like that and taking a piece of paper down to your boss. But you know, the way we accessed information by far and large, a lot of times any kind of free information was always the best, because you could just go grab it, right? So thinking in terms of what are those sources of free information. Now with the internet, you know, I remember I used to have to go down to the courthouse and pour through information to get records related to a property, or, you know, something like that. Now you can access that on the internet, and life is much easier, and things happen a lot quicker. But what I would always say with that kind of access to that data is you always want to get good copies of the information. You know, there's a reason why title companies exist, and that's to make sure that properties are free and clear, and they're, you know, properly documented and all that kind of stuff. So you want to make sure whatever data you're working with, and again, Taka touched on it, is good data, it's accurate. And then, you know, in my career, the utilization was, we used information and data to prosecute people. We used it to prove investigations against criminals for their culpability. And again, as Taka said, you know, treat your data as a source of information. You're never going to rely on one source to prove or to make your point. You're going to need multiple sources, multiple points of data and information in order to show that something potentially happened or didn't happen, or whatever it might be. So free open source data is at our fingertips fairly broadly to anybody that has access to the internet these days. Another area for data that is, I think, useful is, and it's got a cost to it, right? Which is the pay for data type sources. So thinking in terms of like a LexisNexis or an Accurate service. When utilizing those types of resources and that information, it's important to really understand where they're getting their information, right? So when you're depending on a third party for that data, you want to also understand, well, what's their source of that information? And thinking in terms of like a LexisNexis, could be certain reasons why when you run, say, a name and you get 10 addresses associated with that name, where did all those addresses come from? And if you realize, or if you've done the research to identify, well, LexisNexis pulls in information if somebody went to a car dealership and applied for a loan to buy a car, but they put a bogus address on their application. Well, that's the address that's listed and associated with their name. So even though it's there, it's not necessarily accurate. So you really got to understand where the information is coming from, and then again follow up on that information. As I said, then you'd want to, probably go down to, or actually go down to, because that's been my experience, access the those county records online and verify, okay, is this individual actually associated with an address, things like that. So in terms of doing, investigative reporting and looking into things, always really take the extra time to understand where the information you're working with is coming from and what significant issues or concerns. It's really no different. I think, Taka is talking about really big data and thinking in terms of cleaning that data up and everything else. Well, when you're talking about just singular sources of data, you still need to clean it. You still need to understand where it's coming from. And so, there's other ways. Taka indicate, as a law enforcement officer, we use, different types of subpoenas to access information that you may not have access to. But thinking in those kinds of terms of what do you have access to, right? He mentioned Freedom of Information Act, FOIA requests. You're all probably very familiar with that. But that's a tool that's available to you at different levels, depending on, if you're looking for government information and things like that. Thinking in terms of private companies and things, always, think a little bit, be a little abstract about how you think of, is this a publicly traded company? Okay, well, then SEC is probably going to have something on it. If SEC has something, I'll share with you. This is a matter we were discussing yesterday internally, was what about computer matching agreements these days? Can you go look in a federal notice, go research the Federal Register and see, has there been a systems of records notice or a SORN filed that identifies that, hey, you know what, SEC is going to be sharing and doing data matching with another agency. So now you may have another area to go look for information, understanding who's sharing information with who. And it could be a good resource for you. And just understanding, again, how everything works, how your sources, whether it's a digital database or an individual, where are they getting their information from and who are they sharing it with also? Because whoever they're sharing it with, you're probably going to be able to garner some additional information from. So, information and data, again, I think in terms of my career, and, I remember having an investigation back in 2005, I believe it was, and no kidding, we had 100 bankers boxes of paper to pour through. And that's a lot of manual labor to perform that these days. Nobody would touch that, right? And everybody would laugh you out of the room if you tried to haul in 100 boxes of paper and say, hey, here's our evidence. They'd be like, yeah, digitize that and come back in a year. Data these days is so available. It's out there as long as you take additional efforts and time to understand where it's coming from, who it's shared with, and how it's relevant to what you're working on. so that was really sort of the big piece I wanted to share myself, as far as just working with data in general, thinking a little bit more abstract. We had a colleague that was going to join us that unfortunately was unable to, but I also wanted to, I'm going to take some time here to go over, I'm going to share my screen if I can, and go over our website real quick, to give you some knowledge, or at least exposure to our website, how you can go to our website to research and look for reports. You can look for recommendations. You can clarify priority recommendations, as well as GAO is a fairly we're very unique in terms of allowing our staff to speak with media. And so I'm going to show you how to find experts in particular topics that may be of interest to you, that you can feel free to reach out to in the future. And if you have different stories or reports you're working on and you want to get their perspective potentially, I'm going to show you how to do that. So hopefully you can all see my my screen now. You can see GAO's webpage here. It's your standard webpage. Just scroll real quick on the front here. You'll see our recent reports, testimonies that any of our senior executives have performed before Congress will be listed here. Go down legal decisions. If you're not aware, GAO also has a bid protest function, as well as our appropriations law function. So you'll find some legal decisions related to those matters here. Down below, we have our list of featured topics, or sort of the high, top topics that are of interest currently across the nation, and that we are working on. Below that, you're going to see some of our social media exposure, whether it's blog posts, podcasts, tweets, things like that. That information's here. And then down here at the bottom, you're going to see some just quick links to other resources that are available to you to look through, and then your standard stuff that's listed at the bottom of most web pages. But so, to search for reports and testimonies, things like that, you can come up here to this reports testimony. You can use the search function here if you put it in there. And I know we recently did an SBA 8A report. You just type in 8A, hit enter, search. It's going to pull all the reports, and I'll apologize if it's running slowly. Here you'll see there was a bid protest decision related, and it's actually picking up on all the 8As, things like that. But if you wanted to just look at reports, you can now drill down, come over here, hit the report button. Now it's going to drill down on reports that mention 8A. All right. And then this is the report we just issued last month. SBA's taken steps taken to verify tribal recognition for the 8A program. When you select that, it's going to bring you to the report page, which will have a highlights page. It's usually a 1 to 2 page, real brief, give you a high level of why we did the work, what our objectives were, what our findings were, and any potential recommendations we're making. You have access to the full report here, and then here are the GAO contacts related to this particular report, which just so happened to be myself and my colleague Seto Begdoyan. So that's how you would search for reports, specific to particular issues, things like that. And so the next thing we'll cover is looking at recommendations. So if you come to just the reports and testimonies, you don't have to click on it, you hover over it, and you come down to the recommendations database and select that. You're going to see that there's all kinds of things here. So, it describes here what GAO's recommendations are. And of course, priority recommendations are just that. They're what we've identified as priorities that should be addressed sooner than later. And so I'll just do something real simple. If you click view all agencies, for instance, right, you'll get a list of all the agencies where, and the count to the right in parentheses of open recommendations currently for that particular agency and or subgroup within that agency, being one of the agency's different services that they provide. What you'll notice is, say, even like here, right now with Department of Agriculture, there's 109 open recommendations. But if I were to go up here and say list only priority recommendations, which those are the, the most significant ones that GAO feels need to be addressed. Now, if you look at the Department of Agriculture, they have 7 priority recommendations outstanding currently. And so these will change. This information changes regularly as agencies perform, follow up on the recommendations that we've made and provide evidence to GAO that they've addressed the recommendations. Then those recommendations come off of the priority recommendation or recommendation list here. Finally, I mentioned, finding an expert. So if you're on the GAO website and you go to About, and then you select Contact Us, it's going to bring you to this page, and you'll see here it says Find an Expert. So if you click on Find an Expert, what you're going to get is, if you already know the name of who you're looking for, their last name at least, you can select up here from the alphabet, and it'll take you to their names. The other thing you can do is search by keyword, right? So if I were to type in the word fraud and hit search, I just so happen to be the first one to show up because that's in my portfolio, is fraud, waste, and abuse, doing investigations, as well as our FraudNet hotline. But if you scroll, this is Johanna Ayers. She's the managing director of our forensic audit and investigative service team. You'll see fraud pops up for her. Seto is a director in FAIS with me. You'll see it did pick up for Cindy Brown Barnes, who's a MD of our education, workforce, and income security team. She has a CFE, so it's picking up on that her certified fraud examiner license mentions the word fraud. Letitia Love is a director in our international team that used to be here in FAIS, so she has significant fraud experience. Jessica Lucas Judy is in our strategic issues team. Again, she used to be in FAIS and has significant fraud experience, as well as Rebecca Shea. So that is sort of how you can navigate our website to look for reports that may involve topics that you're interested in, to identify recommendations that may be outstanding to different agencies, and to find experts that you could potentially speak with to talk about any reports that you're working on. So I know I talked fairly quick. I think we got about 9 minutes left in the session, and it's up to you how quick you need to get to lunch, but I'll maybe kick it back to you and see if there are any questions.
Well, go ahead.
Thanks. So Congress is exempt from FOIA. Does that mean the GAO is exempt from FOIA? And notwithstanding the answer to that question, though, would GAO ever sometimes, or as a routine matter, provide to journalists on request? You guys have created a database as part of an investigation, and would if we asked for that in a CSV file or a spreadsheet format, something that's not on your website, ever provide that to journalists on requests?
So as you rightly or correctly acknowledged, so yeah, FOIA, that particular Act, Freedom of Information Act, does not apply to GAO because we're in the legislative branch, just as Congress is part of the legislative branch. That said, we do have a records disclosure that is fairly similar to FOIA. So, a lot of, even in just a lot of other requirements that executive branch agencies must follow, GAO does the same in what we say. We follow it in spirit. And that's part of our oversight. We expect, hey, if the agencies and departments that we are reviewing are required to follow certain requirements, then we're going to as well. But yes, so you can submit a request. We do have a records disclosure office, and they will work with you. It's similar that there are some exemptions to requests. And so it would just depend on the specific request as to whether or not GAO is going to provide the information.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, a lot of time GAO's commitment to the auditees that we work with is that GAO will protect the information at or above that level. And so this is where the scope of that oversight comes in, where the protection of that data comes in. So there are perhaps a sort of topic specific nuance that we need to sort of navigate. So I'll give an example. If the request is that would GAO mind sharing all of the tax filing information from individual taxpayer? unlikely. But like, but even if we were to sort of do so, there are additional layers of protection because GAO agree with IRS and how we protect that information. Whoever requests it must also be able to handle that information to the same level of sensitivity. So that potentially could add a level of nuance. So it's not just a spreadsheet to say, here's all the 2022 tax filing. If that request is approved, whoever's receiving it must also be able to protect that information at or above the same level.
Nita, go ahead.
Yes, I'm hoping one of you can answer this question. I'm not sure. I'm wondering, because of all the great work that GAO does, how well your budget is keeping pace with your workload, whether it's going up with your workload or what's going on with your budget, and if you have the people you need to get your jobs done.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to sort of take a stab at it. We, as with any other agency, we go through the budgetary request process, right? Let's set aside the fact that the Congress has not approved a budget, which is a different conversation. But we try to be very specific about the impact that GAO is making through all of our recommendations. And that's where the metrics that comes in to say for every dollar appropriated to GAO has sort of outsized return on investment on behalf of American people. And there are a number of studies that have been made to say over the past 10 years or so, the aggregate saving that GAO was able to realize is actually over $1 trillion. So part of that is conversation with our appropriator to say, these are the sort of portfolio of work that we have in mind. These are the number of people and the skill sets that we need to, do them, and also accounting for some sort of unforeseen events. So we do put together a budget request every year, like any other agency. Knock on wood, I think our appropriators are usually very receptive to what GAO has requested, but we don't live in resource unconstrained world, so they have to do their balancing act. But I would say categorically over the past several years, we have largely received what we have requested. But still, our budget is still measured in M, where most of the other agencies are measured in Bs, and in some cases Ts. So I think we have a sort of ambitious goal as we go through our modernization, as we go through really embarking on the second centennial of GAO. There are more that we would like to do in the foresight arena beyond the oversight and insight function. And so we have very close dialogue with our appropriator to justify those requests and then work with them as they have hearings and whatnot. And Gene Dodaro is really good about this. Whatever question that they have, he's always made himself available to support public hearing, private hearing, and discussion to justify GAO's expenditures. Howard, anything you want to add to that?
No, that's good.
But short answer is we could always use more.
Jacob.
Hey, thanks a lot for being here, guys. This is really useful, and I'm actually really nice to know that your experts are able to speak with the media, which I didn't know, and it's great. I'm just kind of curious how GAO's relationship is with the individual inspector generals at the executive branch agencies, and sort of where you might work together, or sort of how your roles are different.
Yeah, so it's a very good point. It's we refer to them as our sister agencies in the oversight community. And annually we deconflict work with them, right? We don't want to be doing the same work that they're doing, just as they don't with us. We don't work necessarily with them on specific audit work or anything like that. We're independent from them in that work, but we do coordinate to make sure that we don't have that overlap of effort that could occur. So there is a lot of coordination whenever we're considering doing work on any specific topic, and that coordination there's several steps that occur, but one of those includes coordinating with the requisite IG's office to ensure that we're not duplicating efforts or anything like that. That also goes for whether they're, are they planning to look at something similar? Now, all this that I'm saying doesn't mean that we won't look at the same sort of, say, program or something at the same time, because what you may find is there's nuance between the scope of the work that they're performing and the scope of the work we're going to perform. So where we may look at something a little bit higher level because of their position so closely to that program, they may really be getting down into some of the really nitty gritty weeds type stuff. Not that we don't do that, but that's some of the nuance you may see where if we're both doing a review related to the same area, you'll recognize we have deconflicted. Okay, we can still pursue this and it's not really duplication of the effort.
Great, thanks.
Any other questions for Howard or Taka? Or about the GAO in general? Okay, well, I just want to thank you both for joining us here. It was really informative, and we appreciate you giving us your time and your expertise. Can we give them a round of applause?
Yeah, thanks for having us. We may be a relatively modest sized agency, but we definitely have a high aspirations and impact. So thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, have a great day.
Thank you. You too.